At this point in the reading, you should be more familiar with classical conditioning, which is learning associations in the environment. Now, classical conditioning can explain relatively simple reflexive responses like salivation or eye blinks, or even the learning of emotional responses such as fear or anger. But what about more complex behaviors that we engage in our everyday life, such as studying for class, running errands, socializing with friends, deciding to go play soccer? We can think of all of these voluntary behaviors that we engage in on an everyday basis, and we can think about, how do we learn to do those kinds of behaviors? They're not simple reflexive responses. They're more complicated voluntary behaviors. At this point in the reading, we are now moving into another famous or major branch of learning known as operant learning or operant conditioning. Now, this is the learning of behavior via consequences or via feedback. So when you engage in a certain behavior, consequences that you receive can help shape the likelihood of that behavior continuing in the future or not. Just to give you an example, you can imagine that you're in a big lecture hall at the U of A and you raise your hand to answer a question in class. Well, if the instructor is really positive about your response and thanks you for participating and really kind of reinforces your participation, you may be much more likely to raise your hand again in the future. In contrast, if the teacher is maybe sort of condescending or not very reinforcing of your participation, that may cause you in the future to be less likely to raise your hand, as well as the other students who are watching. So the consequences that our behavior have influence the likelihood of those behaviors occurring again in the future. Now, this is called operant conditioning, learning via consequences, and a man by the name of Edward Thorndike really laid the groundwork for this theory. You'll read about his law of effect below, but we'll spend most of this chapter looking at the work of B.F. Skinner. You may have heard of him before. He's a famous behaviorist in psychology. He is a strong believer that the environment controls our behavior, and he formally developed a model for operant conditioning and spelled out sort of all of the different consequences that exist, as well as different schedules that consequences can be administered on. So this is a section that's important to read carefully. Again, in learning, there's a lot of new terminology and lingo that you may not have heard before. So be sure to read this very carefully. I recommend taking some notes, and hopefully by the end of this section, you'll have a more comprehensive understanding of the process of operant conditioning.